people here with us from far away. Welcome, Charles. You can start now.
So good morning, everybody. So this particular subject became interesting to me as I've been introduced to this artist's work 11 years ago in 2013. So this is Purvis Young, born 1943, and raised in Overtown, Miami by Bahamian parents. The artist Purvis Young came of age in a period of upheaval and decline in a once vibrant community. Young dropped out of high school at age 16 in 1959. 2 years later, unfortunately, he's incarcerated in 1961 at Rayford State Prison on breaking and entering charges. So while incarcerated, he began to draw again. And then after serving 4 years at this prison, he's released in 1964. And during that time, he recalled while incarcerated that angels came to him and spoke to him about how to live a better life and the way art could be that vehicle to express his desire to be more than just this high school dropout who would like to have done something with himself. So released from prison, Young found respite in solitude and the art he made while in seclusion. So what you're seeing here is just a little background. This is the first time Young's artwork is mentioned as a object or a spiritual art object within an interfaith church called the Kenisa. So this is the Miami Herald local news section on September 24th, 1976. Again, as I said before, the Kenisa is an
Unmuting other people. There we go.
No, you good. So the muralist movements of the late 1960s really caught Young's eye as public art made by Black, Chicano, and Latino artists appeared to mythologize the urban landscape. Yeah. So here you can see 1213 Northwest 3rd Avenue, the Comer Overtown Branch Library, which is where Purvis's first um, public art was commissioned by a local city government. And then where you see he was a resident at 29 years old in 1972 is one of the studios. So that's where Good Bread Alley is. So just a brief history of Good Bread Alley. So it was essentially a breadbasket for the Black and immigrant Caribbean community. Everything from cornbread to fry bread was created or made there and used as a means of just making money, doing something you already know how to do. So painted between 1968 and 1974, Young's installment entitled Good Bread Alley was a massive undertaking. Affixed to the abandoned buildings were innumerable large paintings made from makeshift canvases comprised of trash from Overtown. So in this way, the first mural was his attempt to reflect the culture of a community passed over by Miami's economic machine and politicians. Shortly after, in 1989, the success of the Third Havana Biennial increases demand for work from the Latin American and the Caribbean context. For this reason, collecting and selling these works took Miami's commercial gallerists by storm. So by 1991, gallerists and critics in the United States successfully lobbied the federal government to temporarily lift a 30-year trade embargo, which helped to promote commercial interest in Cuban art. As a result, the market, relative to Purvis, dispossessed him of his ties to a Euro-Atlantic heritage. Overnight, Young's status as a poor outsider artist from the hood muted all serious consideration of his work as spiritual art objects. So in 2001, the Scott Foreman Gallery brought Purvis Young's art objects to a small town called Dania Beach. Possession became the first show to make explicit the ties Young's work has to the Afro-Cuban religion taught to him by a Santeria priest named Celo Crespo. So prior to this possession show, Young's association with Santeria often began and ended with text bypassing any notion of its influence on his work. Even when shown with other Cuban-American artists such as Carlos Alfonso in the Three from Miami exhibition at the John and Ringling, Mabel Ringling Art Museum, the words used to describe Young's work center on his dreamlike imagery. So more than just a window into Young's land of escape, the possession show takes seriously the spiritual charge of his work. The show presented me with an opportunity to take a deeper dive into Young's praxis and his content. So here's important to consider how this intercultural dialogue between the commercialization of art as a potential fetish and its community of believers clash over the authority regarding who defines meaning. In this particular piece here, or these two pieces here, The Great Mother and The Big Joint, what seems to be prioritized in the possession show from my interviews with Scott Foreman was that he wanted to ensure that the spiritual nature that he perceived in the work was communicated to the audience purchasing the work. In short, that has not always been true about Purvis's work in the commercial market. So an exploration of young art objects influenced by Afro-Cuban heritage and Yoruba thought. The problem with applying traditional art historical approaches to spiritual objects comes from a reactive gesture to categorize Young as an outsider before considering the relevance of his spiritual background. Purvis Young's art objects are influenced by an African consciousness found within Santeria-inspired works of Afro-Cuban heritage. Through an applied ethno-aesthetic lens of interpretation, a new study of Young's works reflect how art is deeply intertwined with Yoruba thought at the heart of this Afro-Cuban religion. So here we see the painting Untitled. I went to the Block Museum to actually look at these works up close. And this is where I began to apply some metaphysics to my understanding of the work as presented. So within metaphysics are critical understanding of the Yoruba concept Ona. In Yoruba, the word Ona translates to an art object made manifest through artistic skill or design. Within the context of Orisha worship, Purvis Young's art embodies the supernatural and a kind of ashe that shines through works like Untitled. Untitled presents a congested arrangement populated with vibrant, animate congregations of dark-colored figures. Each cluster is separated by 4 deep white, green, ocean-colored ellipticals. Various shades of greens and browns with hints of red and yellow seep through from the background to figure Young's dreams. Like much of his work, Untitled would have originally been comprised of separate parts of Overtown's trash or detritus. Of the distinct range of found materials, those most frequently used are particle board, books, a variety of paper, cardboard, nails, and house paint. Once completed, the piece would be absorbed into a mound of artwork that grew until Young painted himself into an enclosed space within his studio. Similarly, Young condenses the space within the painting, and conflict pushes outward toward the viewer. The ellipticals play into that tensile proposition. As arranged, the form acts to guard against the explosive potential of its surrounding figures. The figures that group themselves within the voids that separate them remain bound to the congealed mass and gesture toward the open space above. When examined closer, one can see elements of African consciousness that help decipher Young's art. On the whole, these arrangements and their deeper meaning demonstrate Anthony's metaphysics in a way that is pertinent to his praxis. Something that I want to just bring attention to are the fact that those ovals, the ellipticals that you see, the colors are meant to connote the eyes of the white people that he perceived to be in power over administrative practices, but also systems that continue to impoverish and oppress the community that he was from. So within his paintings, you'll see them sometimes colored green, you'll see them sometimes colored blue. So, but consider the initial setting of Young's art objects occupied, the Kanisa, and its enmeshment with spirituality and dispossession. Through a mix of interfaith religions sharing the same space, ideas of self-reliance commingled with an African consciousness essential to understanding the metaphysics as explained. All the while, Young's paintings served as witness to the true inner workings of the Kanisa and represented a kind of ritual emblem for social, political, and religious purposes. It is within this rich syncretic context that Young's altered figures reveal his ability to understand and engage spiritual forces meant to heal and embattle community. Purvis Young's treatment of figures is a signal to humans that they are divine beings with purpose. Upon closer examination of Untitled, the composition's repeated figures begin to change and halos appear as you move closer to the far right border. Here's another example. Figure dancing with trumpeters on the beach. The same can be said of the halo figures depicted in procession and figure dancing here, where they are commingled among variants. In reciprocal fashion, we receive both the physical body, or aura, and the soul, emi, essential dignified parts of what it means to be human within Yoruba thought. Young lets the viewer know that when one or more of the Oludumare's children are gathered, the Orisha are among them, Oludumare being the creator in the Yoruba belief system. To acknowledge their presence in his painterly gesture is to invoke healing and bring about material change, a belief no doubt shaped by Crespo's teaching and reinforced through Young's Southern Baptist upbringing. Christians in attendance at the Kanisa would have heard a Bible verse that's repeated frequently in the Black Southern Church, Matthew 18:20, which states, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them." Furthermore, Afefe Lanataya Hemba, who wrote the catalog essay for Possession, whom I also interviewed, she stated herself, "When you bring people in mass, the processional aspect of it is indicative of the formalized approach to people being able to unite. There's a unification. The idea here is that there are strength in numbers." As a child of Crespo's Ile, his congregation, the same Emi which resides within Young is operationalized through the halo figures. A student of art history, informally at the Comer Overtown Library, Young would have been exposed to the angular forms and sharp contours of golden halos painted onto saints found in the likes of Byzantine art. Young would then go on to use the motif of the halo to place clear depictions of Santeria deities within his compositions. So, on the order of the creator or Ludumare, Obatala, as you see here on the right by Manuel Mendive, makes humans from divine clay. To consider the minute details within Purvis Young's paintings is to acknowledge the supernatural within figure study with dancers on the left. At first glance, Young painted figure study with dancers in earthen colors of browns, reds, blacks, pink, maroon, green, and yellow with skyish blue-green hues on the first layer of canvas. Anamorphic figures surrounding a large central halo figure appear to echo its circular presence in processional fashion. The physical properties of figure study gestures to a kind of makeshift build stamped by Young's hand. Along the border, its figures enliven the perimeter and are secured to the canvas with hammer-driven nails. Comprised of various pieces of wood and canvas materials, the frame bears mentioning, as Young does attest, that they do sometimes hold meaning. Manuel Mendive's knowledge of Yoruba historical religion and visual tradition help us to decipher the metaphysics within works by Young. In the painting Obatala, compositional elements similar to those found in Young's painting, figure study, can be seen. Both paintings are oriented vertically as if to suggest a reverential theme. The figures in each make gestures toward one large anamorphic figure. Further, Mendive's title lends itself to an interpretation founded in the metaphysics of Yoruba thought. Obatala put the final touches on the divine sculpture of humanity, and then Babatunde Lawal suggests the presence of an inner head or re'inu as the reason behind the emphasis on the head in Yoruba art and ritual. So in speaking about the Ewa, the beauty, as a manifestation of Ashe or power that's imbued within these art objects, there's a good emphasis to be made on the transformative power of Ashe through imbued by the community rather than solely through its aesthetic appeal. As a seer, Purvis Young's aesthetics or his ethics operationalize the generative power of Ashe through his ability to perceive this beauty, this Ewa, in marginalized people and places. In Santeria, a seer would not need to be an initiate to be charged with the mission of an Orisha. Seers exist on the periphery as participants, but are also involved in the life of the community. They attend public ceremonies, and they consult the diviner when needed. Through Young's travels to cities like Chicago, he saw the Wall of Respect. The power of Ashe began to take shape in his art through his making of art objects. So shown here in particular, jugglers and acrobats in the street festival, you see many of the same iconic motifs that are written about throughout the entirety of his background or through his exhibitions and shows. But sprinkled in throughout the figures, you'll see there are some pregnant figures depicted. And those pregnant figures, Young actually perceives them as birthing a new nation that's intended to wash away the sins committed by those who lived during his time that he perceived not having the community's best interests at heart. I want to just bring our attention to the gestures of the same figures, and that those gestures appear to be echoed through body tracks by Ana Mendieta, another artist who's influenced by Santeria heavily. So within those gestures, we can read this influence of not just this holiness and divine revivalist tradition of praise dance or just bodily possession, which occurs both in the practice of Santeria as well as in the Pentecostal church. But those gestures appear to take us back to the place where not only people like Ana Mendieta themselves may have also practiced, but then Young, of course, absolutely witnessed those same practices. So it's in holding that thought where I believe the gestures that you see depicted by Young come from those examples. So in conclusion, I just would like to say there is an invitation to further explore the dialogue on intersections of art, spirituality, and cultural heritage in Young's oeuvre. So delving into the ethno-aesthetics of Santeria and Purvis Young's work helps us to illuminate not only the spiritual underpinnings of his art, but also the cultural context that shapes his creative vision. Still, what remains is an invitation to further explore and dialogue on the intersection of this art, spirituality, and cultural heritage in Young's work. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. I am honored to present my work following yesterday's presentations and to be a part of this panel with Maya, Charles, and Andrea. This presentation comes from the first chapter of my thesis. Somewhere along the extended relationship of Beatriz Gonzalez to the concept of province is an anecdote involving her sister Lucila, an art historian, professor, and director of Bucaramanga's Museo de Arte Moderno for over 20 years. Lucila Gonzalez will often make a distinction about herself as de provincia pero no provinciana, from the province yet not provincial, a commentary that acknowledges the sisters' origin outside the Colombian capital of Bogota while stating their highly educated upbringing, and one that recognizes the political and cultural centralism of many Latin American countries, but rebukes any stereotype of ignorance or lack of worldly self-awareness for people outside major urban centers. Beatriz, one of the most influential artists in Latin America, drew inspiration from this quote for the title of her first coffee table book, Beatriz González, una pintora de provincia, Beatriz González, a painter from the province, published in 1988. The choice of title cemented the association that began in 1976 when the artist published a short text in connection to her first retrospective at Museo La Tertulia in Cali, Colombia. In the text, reproduced by the museum as a didactic material, González declared, "I feel connected to the history of a province and not to the universal satisfactions in search of truth of international artists. I feel I am the precursor of a Colombian art. What's more, of a provincial art that cannot circulate universally as anything but a mere curiosity." In the book's main essay, curator, critic, and collaborator Carolina Ponce de Leon became the first to endorse and elevate González's provincial character to the status of leitmotif. While Ponce de Leon was among the first to address the quote, neither she nor González, and for that matter any other curator or academic, have expanded on its definition. My intention with this thesis is precisely to outline the initial framework in González's use of the word provincial, subsequently describing how it has evolved and gained further complexity. Although the artists, curators, and scholars and viewers have seen it suitable to gather a prolific body of work that began in the 1960s, Gonzalez's extensive bibliography doesn't offer a clear understanding of this concept and the political project that lies behind it. I find that within this repeated use of provincial, each allusion can hold different layers of meaning and nuance, while assuming that its recipient holds or sees the same, which can become an increasingly disparate experience as the artist's recognition outside of Colombia and Latin America keeps growing. Despite this increased recognition of her practice beyond Latin America over the past 15 years, reaching the United States and Europe thanks to multiple venue retrospectives, the participation in important exhibitions and significant institutional acquisitions, including the Art Institute of Chicago, Gonzalez's work has only been the subject of one monographic work, which also happens to be in English. It is certainly interesting that Ana Maria Reyes' 2019 PhD thesis, The Politics of Taste, Beatriz Gonzalez and Cold War Aesthetics, published by Duke University Press, holds the title Considering Gonzalez's Undisputable Impact as a Historian, Curator, and Mentor in Colombia. While I won't get into too much detail, I find that Reyes' analysis of the beginning of Gonzalez's career in the frame of cultural politics of the Cold War at times lacks nuance and replicates the common US-based position of Latin America as a passive recipient of culture. So by following the leads in Gonzalez's words throughout the years and gathering precedents in the writings of Ponce de Leon and other important figures in Latin American art, such as Marta Traba, I will describe the key elements that shaped Gonzalez's initial self-positioning as a provincial artist. In addition, in following Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference, I will also connect Gonzalez's work to the pursuit of subaltern studies by way of a dimension of province that highlights sub- or secondary subjects, whether it is a region, country, or subcontinent labeled subdesarrollado, underdeveloped, the gusto popular of the working classes and its perceived parochialness, the regional newspapers that are often the source of drawings and paintings, or the figure of the poor and the displaced who became the face of Colombia's many violences. Earlier, I called this provincial character a political project, and now I make my own distinction as Gonzalez not only uses province and provincial to gather different components of her work, but also to turn it into an operation. Similarly to Chakrabarty and the Subaltern Studies group, Gonzalez also sought to provincialize. In the first 2 decades of her artistic production, she provincialized the art made in Europe by uncovering the development of a hierarchy that makes certain works universal, a process that recognizes the equal role and the participation of subalterns. The same provincializing operation applies to her emphasis on the role of clases populares in shaping their taste and the taste of local elites, as well as the example of the figure of the carguero or porter becoming an artistic icon. Rooted in acute self-awareness, Gonzalez began her career by reappropriating masterpieces such as Manet's, transformed under her hand in 1978 into Telón de la Cambiante Naturaleza, curtain of the moving and shifting nature. Following her participation with this and 2 other curtains in the 38th Venice Biennale, Gonzalez elaborated on the extent to which even her direct encounters with nature have been mediated by her familiarity with reproductions of famous works of art, while also stating that, quote, she has spent many years trying to locate European works of art in my environment, end quote. The anecdote of finding Manet's work in a dusty and faded encyclopedia cover, which she came to see as the only record through which Colombians received the changing nature that Impressionists tirelessly looked for, is another allusion to her self-positioning as provincial, but also an account of the systems that built a hierarchy that consistently elevates and disseminates the art of a specific region. By adding that, quote, to me, nature itself isn't anything but the big backdrop curtain of this culture, end quote, Gonzalez proved how subaltern societies can represent themselves through reappropriation, a process that doesn't center the subaltern individual on their nationalist or regionalist accounts, which are most frequently naive, but rather highlights the power and legitimacy of their new images. Aligned with some of the objectives of subaltern studies, the artist, quote, does not call for a simplistic, out-of-hand rejection of modernity, liberal values, universals, science, reason, grand narratives, totalizing explanations, and so on, but rather that which resists and escapes the best human effort at translation across cultural and other semiotic systems. As part of this worldly self-awareness, Gonzalez doesn't advocate for a nebulous return to our origins or the culture of our ancestors, but instead recognizes an equal responsibility between European and the so-called Third World societies in making the former a synonymous of modernity and modern art. Yet it is crucial to note that while I draw connections between Gonzalez and the framework of subaltern studies, I don't go as far as aligning her work with this field of post-colonial studies. Nevertheless, I found the coincidence of focus on peripheric societies, themes, and social classes as agents of transformation instead of passive recipients of culture, one that could highlight the prescience in Gonzalez's earlier production. My intent in drawing this parallel is not to find additional backing for Gonzalez's importance in Latin American art, something which has repeatedly been done, but rather to provide a broader framework of our understanding that could be useful for audiences, particularly those unfamiliar with her work outside Latin America. With this work, I also aim to illustrate how artists and scholars in underdeveloped or subaltern societies feel compelled to engage with European and US art history, while the latter often operate in ignorance of those they have deemed provincial. The irreverent. Imagine, if you will, a lady's living room suddenly invaded by the furniture of the domestic help or the painted furniture of the salesperson from around the corner. Even worse, it is though through the most random sequence of events, that assortment of beds, tables, trays, or dressers, pure tackiness, found its way to none other than the Museum of Modern Art in the planetarium, where, of course, the elegant visitors ignore them while running checkbooks in hand to buy Luis Caballero's paintings. This is how an article in 1973 begins its account of Gonzalez's exhibition at Bogotá's Museo de Arte Moderno. Beyond the revealing classist humor, I choose to rescue these words because I find they gather some of the elements that inform Gonzalez's initial use of the word provincial, specifically her reception as an outcast from Bucaramanga, a provocative figure lacking the sophistication expected from an artist with such level of exposure. As the press in Bogotá reported at the time, quote, the painter Beatriz González exhibited her recent work at the Museum of Modern Art alongside her friend and classmate at Universidad de los Andes, Luis Caballero. While this painter, who resides in Paris, sold absolutely all of his pieces, her fellow artist, who lives in Bogotá, didn't sell a single of her works in the shape of furniture, end quote. These lines contain additional elements that outline González's positioning at the time. The elitist perceptions of value tied to migrating to a foreign city like Paris or New York, a decision driven by various social and political factors that nonetheless almost became a norm for artists and writers seeking local validation. Consider just two of Colombia's most notable examples, Gabriel García Márquez, who left the country in 1961, and Fernando Botero, who permanently relocated in 1960. In addition, this article unravels an interesting paradox. While most collectors and buyers at the time didn't see much value in González's thesis, she has been the recipient of multiple awards and recognitions since she graduated from Universidad de los Andes in 1962. By 1973, when the article was published, she had been given 5 solo shows, including 3 museum shows. Between 1962 and 1973, she also participated in approximately 30 group exhibitions, including the 11th Sao Paulo Biennial and 2 other international exhibitions in Buenos Aires and San Juan in 1971. In contrast with the apparent lack of recognition from local collectors, stands her resume of exhibition and the validation of the most important curators and critics in Colombia, such as Marta Trau, a paradox from which one would assume a lack of connection with certain local elites and their cosmopolitan values. Hence, the mere curiosity part of González's famous statement. In connection with her first retrospective in Cali in 1976, an additional press article stands out. Quote, when people talk or write about Beatriz González, almost without exception, they add the adjective of controversial. If her painting has shock value, it is because she does everything in her power to cause a scandal, to irritate, to put her finger in the wounds of institutions, end quote. The piece, written by Pilar Kafur, entitled The Irreverent, She Paints on Towels, also features various quotes by the artist offering insights into her career and her most recent paintings in support, such as large curtains and bath towels, including her appropriations of works such as Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. Responding to any criticism, the 44-year-old Gonzalez stated, "I am not trying to attack or be disrespectful to the artist I use as inspiration. They have nothing to do with my work. It is simply my nonconformity with the cult cuts of culture because the class that never had access to art is gaining it through encyclopedias promoted by publishing houses that want to turn it into a matter of mere consumption," end quote. With this article and the inclusion of the artist's words, a new component of her provincial character is summoned. Gonzalez deliberately positioned herself as an artist with no desire to conform to viewers' expectations of academicism and formal artistic skill. Embracing the notion of provincial, she rejected the adherence to dexterity or endorsed visual languages, which at the time included expressionism a la Luis Caballero, Botero's Boterismo, and the geometric abstraction of Eduardo Ramírez Villamizar, Edgar Negret, and Carlos Rojas at the opposite end of the spectrum. Describing her paintings as deliberately clumsy, Gonzalez persisted in employing vivid colors and streamlining and flattening images, an intentional departure from the artistic conventions established by previous generations. As Ana Maria Reyes points out, quote, her artistic engagements with lowbrow subject matter and materials saturated with local, gender, and class references stood in stark contrast to the demands for artists to produce sophisticated, exportable works as evidence of Latin American modernity, best represented by the rise of prominence of geometric abstraction, end quote, but adding to that also kinetic and op art. Here, too, emerges a critical perspective on social class and subaltern elites, which beyond the popular taste notion has rarely been addressed in Gonzalez's work. It signals a critique of Colombian upper classes extendable to Latin America and beyond, who oscillated between French and English societies as philosophical and cultural norths for a multitude of processes. The list is very long and spans multiple centuries, including a number of paradoxes such as their own independence movements, different guidelines of taste, sophistication, and cosmopolitanism. Gonzalez's remarks also speak of a more specific time infatuation, namely the fixation of Latin American intellectuals with the Cuban Revolution, criticism of the intervention of the US in the region, and the pride originating in the appropriation of Latin America's underdeveloped and third world narratives. Despite her engagement with critiques of capitalism and her participations in Havana's Casa de las Americas, Gonzalez's words and works avoid idealized images of La Revolución and socialism and instead embody her trademark and ironic and unadorned perspectives. In addition, this last article provides a valuable quote on her origins. "I am from Santander, and that hasn't allowed me to assimilate the Bogotano." Although the artist spent a few years of her childhood and permanently relocated to Bogota after beginning college, stressing her Santander origins also became a way of stating her difference in navigating the art scene in Bogota from an off-center position. On paper, the Beatriz Gonzalez of the 1970s had everything to blend in. She came from an upper-class background with connections in Bogota and received a privileged artistic education under the mentorship of Marta Traba and Spanish painter Juan Antonio Roda. Despite being a woman in college in the 1960s, she has often mentioned that she didn't receive a different treatment due to Trava's tutelage and the fact that fine arts was the only program with more women than men. These biographical details highlight the irony in her positive reception by her fellow artists, curators, and critics, in contrast by the puzzled treatment by the press and collectors. Specifically, they point the controversy to her unsophisticated treatment of European/cult works of art and images taken from the media, as well as her use of cheap supports and material. Finally, Beatriz Gonzalez's identification as a provincial artist stems from uncovering a set of complex ideas in what may initially pass for obvious or anecdotal. As in many centralist regimes, and particularly in most Latin American countries, in the second half of the 20th century, internal migration to capital cities grew exponentially and was also the case for many successful Colombian artists of the time, such as Botero, Negret, Ramírez Villamizar, and Rojas. If being a provincial artist, in the standard use of the term, was not uncommon, it is interesting to realize how Gonzalez turned it into a marker of difference and defiance against the attitude of local elites. Up to the mid-1980s, Gonzalez provincialized through her experimental approach to popular taste and the various forms of circulation of images. Her renditions of, quote, universal works of art are often emphasize just how much her likeness was altered in their migration to Latin America, and thus the varying degree of indirectness in her early works. Take, for instance, La Última Mesa, The Last Table, completed in 1970 and shown at the Sao Paulo Biennial the following year. Gonzalez's furniture piece was not inspired by Da Vinci's The Last Supper, but rather a popular stamp of the painting sold in Colombia by Gráficas Molinari. Altered to appeal to local consumers, the stamp of the Renaissance work was commissioned as an image of protection. By hanging it over the entrance of their house, a family signaled their Catholic beliefs and the reinforced safeguard of their home by Jesus and the 12 apostles against any unwelcome visitors. Under Gráficas Molinari's treatment, the image was given a bright and colorful palette, which the artist transformed further. The composition was taken to a cheap metallic table painted to mimic the appearance of wood, a paint job that came from the original manufacturer of the table, discovered by the artist in a popular market in Bogotá. Gonzalez completed the piece using industrial enamel on a metallic sheet that she connected to the top of the furniture, assembling her flattened and streamlined image into a found object. However, by the mid-80s, a new dimension of provincial had arrived. Gonzalez abandoned humor to create a record of the pervasiveness of violence in Colombia, whether through depicting its most somber episodes, reflecting on the exploitation of violence in the media, or denouncing political and military leaders and their hidden agendas. Gonzalez continued to work from images taken from the media, but this time from the perspective of an artist and historian critically engaged with the unavoidable reality of the country. This change was solidified by the 1985 siege of the Palace of Justice in Bogotá by the leftist guerrilla group M19, which resulted in 98 people killed and 11 disappeared. Following the occupation of the building by the guerrilla group, Colombia's then president Belisario Bentancur responded by storming the building with a tank and army troops carrying automatic weapons. The siege, the crossfire that resulted in the burning of the palace, as well as the massacre and disappearance of victims, left a scar of shock and doubt in Colombian society that remains to this day. By 1998, when Una Pintora de Provincia was published, Carolina Ponce de Leon used the artist's quote on her provincial character to signal, quote, the relationship of equivalence between Colombia and the reality of the work of Beatriz González, end quote. While Ponce de Leon didn't elaborate much or give a precise frame for this association, particularly in one of the final sections of her essay, she provided some key historical guidelines. With her statement, and for that matter, with her entire exploration of popular culture, González's goal was not to rescue a national identity. It doesn't breathe the romantic era of the 1920s and 30s in Latin America, when artistic independence was declared by promoting the social and cultural values of people. Secondly, she pointed to the international circulation of González's work as a mere curiosity by stating that outside Colombian borders, the anecdotal side acquires a category of curiosity. This alludes to the artist's acknowledgement that the specific reference to events and Colombian figures in her work and titles, ranging from presidents and celebrities to the victims of different types of violence, got lost in the presence of international viewers, as she had encountered in the Sao Paulo and Venice Biennial. The curiosity portion also suggests the cliches and common misconceptions about Colombia and Latin America as exotic, tropical, colorful, and a happy-to-be-there place. And I'm running out of time, but I'm almost done. Besides the creation of an archive of violence, one thing I find implicit in Ponce de Leon's linking of the history of Colombia with the work of Beatriz González is the equation of the country with a province, an outpost of European and US images where both the indispensability and unsuitability of concepts such as modernity and development are acknowledged and challenged. So yes, González meant Colombia as a province of Europe and the United States, just as much as she meant Bucaramanga as a province of Bogota, a province inside a larger province. Up to the 1980s, the period where Gonzalez's first province took shape, she nodded to the anachronisms imprinted in Latin American societies, centuries in the making ideas about progress, culture, and sophistication that Latin Americans embraced but inevitably altered. Provincial is a concept tied to the past, and by calling herself as such, she recognized that the only way to be an original artist, and therefore contemporary, was to engage with it. Beatriz Gonzalez grew up during a period where the intense critical thinking around modernity and capitalism gained widespread circulation in Latin America. By the time she started working, the acknowledgement that European and US images were anything but universal was not new. However, she used the concept of province as a badge of honor, as well as to illustrate how this decentralization took place. For over 6 decades now, Gonzalez has used her self-identification as a verb. To provincialize is to decenter, to surreptitiously assert one's creative agency, to make anew from the margins. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mayrti Saucedo, and I will be presenting my in-progress speech titled A Rejection of the Adoption Nation. 12 to 50,000, numbers delicately stitched into the central thigh, hidden beneath Benjamin Lundberg Torres Sanchez's pant leg. As far as I knew, no one other than myself, Benjamin, and the gallery director knew exactly what was hidden on their skin that day. Throughout the opening reception in the summer of 2021 for the exhibition Hilos at Latchkey Gallery in New York, I felt myself observing Benjamin, seeing them interact so normally and gently and passively with friends and visitors. In my observation, there was something familiar about their gestures and their mannerisms, knowing what was hidden underneath their pant leg. At one point, during the opening, Benjamin moved towards the corner of the gallery, taping a 2-by-2 foot square on the cement floor. Benjamin stepped into the square and remained there for the rest of the performance. The performance began with Benjamin speaking about themselves, of others, of us within the adoptee community. Recollecting from my own memory, their words spoke as a lecture, as an oral history, and as a monologue. And as they spoke, they revealed that what was underneath the pant leg to the rest of the audience, an audience that only a few knew, including myself and Benjamin, consisted of several of our fellow adoptees. The thread used, so thin from afar, was faint, barely visible, yet we could still see the redness of their surrounding skin, making out the section of puncture marks. Getting down on one knee, their stitched leg popped up. They stated that the number shown on their thigh was the dollar amount that their adoptive parents paid for them, $12,000 to $50,000. Benjamin then invited us to help them in removing this trauma, this history, this violence, the invisible wounds now made visible by using the tools provided to us on a red cloth on the cement ground. At first, no one from the audience moved. The brief pause and silence was broken by my movement towards Benjamin. Going towards them, I knelt with both knees on the ground and, while trembling, slowly cut away a single piece of thread from one puncture to the other and placed the thread on the red fabric. Eventually, others followed suit. What was removed? And how did we, as participants in this performance, assist in this removal? What exactly was this violence that we were tasked with taking away? As fellow adoptees, I and many in the audience understood very well that this was being removed was only a small segment of the conditions under which our bodies are perceived within an adoption nation. In Benjamin's performance, we see a small segment of those conditions through commodification, the price for their body in exchange for the creation of a reproductive paradise, or as Benjamin would put it, a type of reproductive futurism where the nuclear family is a core to the utopia of a nation. So what happens when this image is shattered? What happens the very moment that Benjamin reveals the stitching of the price of their body to the audience? What happens when the adoption nation is rejected? Within the field of critical adoption studies, this rejection begins with the acknowledgement and recognition of the system of adoption and its origins, specifically in the US, as born from the creation of a settler nation as a methodology of power born out of genocide. In this acknowledgement within the field, adoption has been critically dissected and analyzed, seen not just as child welfare and family practice, but as an intersectional tool and mirror of global imperial, racial, and colonial history. It is from this perspective that I begin the foundations of my research and where I begin to listen to the work of my fellow adoptee artists, Benjamin Lungberg Torres Sanchez, a transnational adoptee adopted from their birth nation of Colombia to the United States, and Mireille K. H. Lee, a transnational adoptee adopted from their birth nation of South Korea to the United States. In collaboration with performance art and practice, in collaboration with their own bodies, this thesis seeks to gain an understanding in how, as adoptees, can we use our bodies and separate ourselves from the perception under the adoption nation, and learn from how Benjamin and Mireille reject it. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will speak briefly of a few works featured in my thesis from each artist in relation to my first chapter, where I seek to understand a potential methodology from their work for rejection. With this, I would like to think back to my initial question. How are we as adoptees perceived under the adoption nation? To begin to answer this question, I want to go back really quickly to Benjamin's performance. The addition of the stitching of their body could be perceived as that, an addition, but more so, we could understand it clear under the guise of a surfacing of perhaps an already existent augmentation. In my use of augmentation, I turn to scholar Ellen Peel and her application of constructed body studies is parallel to adoption studies. In constructed body studies, the constructed body can be defined in two ways. One, a body that is constructed by modification in possible ways such as organ transplantation or impossible ways such as vampirism. And two, a body that is constructed mentally, perceived through projection to be of a significantly different kind than what it actually is, such as an automaton perceived as a woman. Peel views adoption as a constructed body that disconnects conceiving from raising through their comparison to nature through an act of performance. This performance Peel refers to is the performance of nature. Peel states, quote, "An adoptee is imagined to be like a natural child, and an adopted family imagined to be like a natural family. They are to act as if their bond are natural, and presumably the birth family is to act as if its lack of such a bond were natural. So now the question is, what is the natural that is performed, and what is the constructed adopted body meant to perform?" If we look at the origins of our contemporary system of the adoption industrial complex, we see that the root of its creation is in policies of family separation, a history that scholar Laura Briggs delves into deeply in much of her scholarship. In her research, Briggs specifically positioned the use of family separation as a vehicle for cultural and political power through removing one from their own geographic, cultural, or biological connection. In this separation of connection, there is a space for malleability, for a body to be re-identified, assimilated, and augmented with the influence and control from their colonial, political, and national power. In the case of this research, this national power would be the United States, or the adoption nation, as it proclaimed itself in the 2000 Census Bureau's report on adopted children and stepchildren. Since at least the late 1870s, Indigenous children in the US were subjected to forced assimilation through family separation and placement in residential schools. This assimilation tactics were meant to, quote unquote, kill the Indian, save the man, completely augmenting the native body and, as pictured here, stripping their identity physically and mentally and reconstructing them under the, quote, natural image of whiteness. The adoption network between South Korea and the United States at the end of the Korean War was built on this racialization of Korean children through the United States and whiteness. According to Elena Kim and James Kyung-Jun Lee, transnational adoption was a solution to mixed-race children fathered by US and UN soldiers that quickly morphed into the institutionalized practice of adopting full Korean children. Korean children were considered to be extensions to whiteness due to the racialization of mixed children as Black and due to American racial logic of the one-drop rule. At the same time, due to Cold War Orientalism, white Americans gravitated towards adopting Korean children, perceiving their role as Americans to educate and raise them in American citizenship. Like South Korea, adoption from Latin America was considered a humanitarian issue to save children from facing poverty, racism, fascism, and communism. The anti-communist stance in the US during the Cold War leveraged the same saviorism as a means to erase Latin Americanism from the roots of adopted children. With intense interventionism in both Korea and Latin America, continued by the Reagan administration in the 80s, the networks between them became imperial projects of American economic interests and reaffirmed senses of American responsibility. Within these phrases of becoming natural, the constructed adopted body engages in several stages of an expected performance, the performance of the natural, of the nation, and of the ideological systems of their inherited cultural landscape. Each of these layers of expected performance builds to create the construction of an ideal adoptee. This codependent system relies on the successive re-identification and augmentation, and for adoptees to accept this through a continued durational performance. But this performance is not one with free movement. The body is restricted. The constructed adopted body is only meant to perform through a list of accepted prostheses or attachments through their body that assist them in completing these performances successfully through modified and mental augmentation. But what this performance fails to take into account is the constructed adopted body existing in not just their prostheses, but in the non-augmented forms of their body as well. This is where performance enters a space of rejection. Where the performance of the constructed adopted body fails, performance also allows a revelation of the adoptee to reject one form of performance through another. To exemplify this, I will briefly touch upon performance series Lumbertores Sanchez's Lumbertores Sanchez and Ree's Trans-Koreaning or I Like Korea and Korea Likes Me. In an attempt to become quote-unquote authentically Korean, Ree began a durational series of performances titled Trans-Koreaning or I Like Korea and Korea Likes Me in 2016. Inspired by Teshing Shea's one-year performances, Ree attempted to become Korean in every way possible through language, culture, mannerisms, legal citizenship, and become quote-unquote full-time Korean. As part of this performance in 2017, Ree decided to reject her United States citizenship, one gained from, as Ree calls, a forced migration, and attempted to reclaim her South Korean citizenship. The documentation of this process displayed in a series of installations and video works show a mirror and timeline from the documentation of her adoptive parents, beginning the process of her adoption, to gaining U.S. citizenship, to her applications for South Korean citizenship, to her official letter of recognition from the South Korean government. In just the naturalization process itself, we see a clear legal rejection of the performance of a U.S. adoptee citizen in an attempt to revert back into what I would call a pre-severed or pre-adopted biography, where she reclaims her biography and attempts to erase the act of forced migration. In this moment already, we see her using the prosthetics, in this case citizenship, against itself, replacing a performance of an adoptee in the U.S. to a quote-unquote authentic Korean non-adoptee. As part of the performance, she followed strict regimented guidelines, including only speaking Korean no matter how broken, only using a re-performance of Adrian Piper's calling cards as a way to communicate, attempting to not shatter the process or image of her authentic Koreanness by halting her body from performing and indicating her performance through the calling cards. Hitting the halfway point of the durational performance, Ree documented in a digital diary titled Trans-Koreaning Halfway Point, where she airs her frustrations of trying to reclaim her South Korean identity. Through tears and broken Korean, she states that she can no longer endure as the trauma is too much. She explains that in the corrections of her Korean from her language coach, the trauma of the misogyny and gendered abandonment are being presented to her again, mentioning that South Korea has not changed from when she was an orphaned child. For Ree, this performance is a failure, but the failure is not in its rejection of the nation, but it's the failure for her to perform the desire of her speculative pre-adoption life, one that I would find akin to Salman Rushdie's imaginary homelands, that he describes as the physical alienation, unallowing one to be capable of reclaiming what is lost, and instead create fictions of invisible imaginary homelands. In this case, Ree did what many adoptees do, attempt to reclaim an imaginary homeland that was fed by desire. In the first part of their three-part series, Lumbertores Sanchez, titled Naturalization, Benjamin re-performs their naturalization ceremony, what they call their, quote, first public documentation as a United States citizen. Entering the stage disguised as a product of Colombia, throughout the 7-minute performance, Benjamin, dressed in the same Sailor Moon costume as on the image projected on the wall behind them, recites the Pledge of Allegiance and the naturalization oath of allegiance to the United States of America, while rubbing their face with a bar of soap, literally cleansing themselves from the stain of this process. After cleansing their bodies, standing in front of a microphone, they move into a sermon as a proclamation of the spiritual implications of citizenship and a declaration to reject the United States itself to the audience seated in front of them. Similar to Lundberg Torres Sanchez uses the prosthetic with the idea of naturalization, but instead of fully rejecting it, uses it as a collective call of autonomy through taking it from the context of a naturalization ceremony or from a state of memory, choosing to recall the ceremony that they could not fully articulate and understand at a young age. What Lundberg Torres Sanchez does instead is alter the ceremony and subvert it through their ability to cleanse their constructed body from the implications of the ceremony itself, and subvert the preaching of the desire for us to act as natural ideal adoptees, and instead reject augmentation and exist in autonomy. In the second part of Lundberg Torres Sanchez's performance titled Colombioplasty, Benjamin walks onto a fabric made of coffee filters. Just as a medical professional, they announce that patient Benjamin Lundberg, formerly Juan Carlos Torres, will be undergoing a Colombioplasty, a procedure to make them appear more Colombian and accentuate their pre-existing Colombian-ness. Inviting the audience to collaborate, they address them as surgeons, asking them to approach their undressed body, laid atop the coffee filters, and make surgical marks to where they should be altered to appear more Colombian. Like the unnamed performance mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the audience was implicated in attempting to process the conditions of their body. In this case, instead of removal, the audience was asked to add onto their body and help extract their Colombianness through the surface. In their instructions to the audience, they present their family medical history, physically describing their birth mother as the map for their approach to Lundberg Torres Sanchez's own body. Throughout the post-performance documentation, looking at the markings made on their body, the interpretations and assumptions of their body and their Colombianness, we see the approach was the treatment of a body as a surface. In approaching this project, Lundberg Torres Sanchez wanted the audience to, quote, engage the assumptions, desires, and questions of the body politic at hand, provoking a force that is at once external to the artist and agent over their identity. With this in mind, the markings on their body varied in the approach to their othering of the body. Some markings proved similar to tattoos, the traditional mom in a heart image, depiction of a coffee cup, doodles, stitches, animals, treating the body as surface rather than through the prompt itself. What about these images brought out their Colombianness? On the other hand, some participants humanized the body through text, writing Colombiano también, I am Colombian too, and soy humano first, I am human first. In the case of Colombioplasty, there are two forms of invisibility that surface: an invisibility of the other body and the invisibility of what Benjamin calls the root of the root, within attempting to find a connection to their pre-adopted identity. We see the other invisibility of the body, and in particular, markings made that treat the body as a surface, as a skin, and as external. In the invisibility through the root of the root, we see that the invisibility through desire, the desire for the connection to culture and an understanding of culture. Through this research practice, Benjamin is engaging in a version of a speculative process, using their body as a starting point and using the responses of the audience in order to fill the gaps of their speculation, while also understanding their perceptions of their own constructed adopted body. In many of their performance projects, both Lundberg Torres Sanchez and do not fully escape from the constructed adopted body. They both still remain in those states, but are instead attempting to recontextualize their existences through emphasizing the critical in the adoption complex. They both reject the adoption nation, but yet still are fully tied to it. In this case, it is worth considering that in their rejection of the adoption nation, they are engaged in Jose Esteban Muñoz's disidentifications, where, quote, disidentification is meant to be descriptive of the survival strategies the minority subject practices in order to negotiate a phobic majoritarian public sphere that continuously elides or punishes the existence of subjects who do not conform to the phantasm of normative citizenship. The question then is, have and Lundberg Torres Sanchez reached disidentified states through their performances? In a sense, I would say yes, as they have found themselves in spaces moving away from both the constructive and speculative, while not fully detaching. In understanding their performances, their practices are not full severing of their constructed adopted bodies, but a subversion of that severing. The severing still remains. We see this in their use of prostheses, constructed, newly created, even pre-existing, as forms of moving back and forth between augmentation. So then what does the constructed adopted body become through disidentification? In the rest of my project, one that is ongoing and endless, as it expands into the realms of desire, of what as adoptees we can do through performance, how we can use speculation as a way to find a moment to breathe in our augmentations, and how our bodies can find mobility again outside of the stiffness of our constructed adopted bodies. In both Benjamin and Mireille's practices, we can find several forms and methodologies that adoptees can use to reject the multiple conditions we exist under within an adoption nation, including new prosthetics, disidentification, and performance art as a way to liberate ourselves from constraints. Because of the range of methodologies I have found within their practices, there is an important aspect to my research in order to fully grasp how we act in rejection, and that is application. In my own artistic practice, I have found that I rely on abstraction and the absence of my body in order to remove myself from augmentation. But for the last few years, I have been attempting to find a way to grant my body mobility and visibility in my practice. So as the final part of this project and to complete this research, I will be applying a few of the methodologies that I have learned from my fellow adoptee artists in a second iteration of a performance I did in the spring of last year, next Friday at SIC Site Galleries. Through this performance is where this part of my research will potentially reach a closer end. Thank you.
Right. Hi. So I'm presenting Los Recursos del Cielo, The Resources of Heaven, work entitled Venezuelan Modernism and the Contemporary Oil Aesthetics of Alessandro Valteo Jaspek, which looks at the, Federico Adesar, which looks at the impact of political events in the artistic and architectural landscape of Venezuela, starting with the radical modernization of, in the 50s, tracing a line between the modern to the contemporary and the current decline of the country. Exploring the works of these two artists, reflecting on the critical view of the modernist history of the country and its effects. A little bit of the outline and introduction. One recurring theme is the use and impact of resources, especially of oil, which arguably has been a key defining aspect of the downfall or failure of modernism in Venezuela. Fernando Coronil, in The Magical State, argues that if modernity is a process characterized by the incessant, obsessive, and irreversible transformation of a world splintered in these distinct entities, then the effects of oil production and consumption reflects the spirit of modernity. The impact of the exploitation of these resources was crucial for the transformative Venezuelan modernization project. As the promise of heaven clashes with the realities of early complexities, it raises the question between the promises, if these promises were indeed successful. Chapter 1, Sucursal del Cielo and Aesthetics of Oil, looks at the different collaborative projects of Alessandro Valteo that manifest cultural criticism. Chapter 2, Failure of Modernism, Modern Petrol Ruins, delves into the exploration of these modernist ruins, highlighting how architectural can transition into provisional use with Federico Valle's works. And third chapter reflects in the collapse of the country due to the migration and social political interventions that left damaged institutional infrastructure, looking at brain drain. Just a little bit about the artist. Alessandro is Venezuelan, born in 1972 in Caracas. And his hybrid practice incorporates the art activities of researcher, archivist, historian, and curator. He now lives and works in Berlin. And Federico studied also born in Caracas in 1972, studied drawing, painting, and sculpture and lived for a few years in London and currently lives in Bogota, Colombia. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on chapter 1, which is Sucursal del Cielo and the Aesthetics of Oil, that focuses on Alessandro Valteo's work. Caracas has often been referred as Sucursal del Cielo, branch of heaven, since the mid-20th century due to the oil boom and then its relentless modernization projects during this period. Alessandro Valteo Jaspek exhibition titled Pedacito del Cielo, Little Piece of Heaven, which was exhibiting in 2008 at the CERT Gallery of the Visual Arts in Harvard University. The proposal is a reconstruction of modernism in Venezuela as a critical look at how geometric abstraction had been used, embedded in the Venezuelan artistic and cultural fabric. As he stated, if the grid is the new palm tree of Latin American art, we are making progress. The exhibition was organized by Jose Falconi and Valteo Jaspek. The exhibition handout titled Errata stated that the artist curator still does not understand how to separate art making from curating. Blurring the line between the roles of artist and curator, this approach led itself to a narrative that positioned the artist as a historian, transforming the exhibition into arguably an installation of his own. The exhibition presented works by canonical Venezuelan artists such as Gego and Gert Leufer, Otero, Carlos Raúl Villanueva, alongside less familiar figures such as Eugenio Espinosa and Claudio Berna. Alongside a collection of archival materials, Valteo Jaspek reconstructed this history through a chronological framework, which the exhibited works were grouped accordingly to decades spanning from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s until 2008. Among there were documentary photographs capturing moments of Venezuelan history alongside government brochures providing insight into social political concepts of the time. The exhibition continued with photographs by Paolo Gasparini and Alejandro Otero's Policromia, which he stated that in the Rata, there are no photographs documenting the current state of Caracas City. All photos of the architectural hall are from the 1950s. One of the most significant projects of Venezuelan modernization was the Ciudad Universitaria, University City, Universidad Central de Venezuela, developed by architect Carlos Raúl Villanueva in the 50s. Valteo Jaspek acknowledged again in the Rata that there is a bias towards Villanueva's government-supported architectural projects which overlook other architectural developments. This project is often referred as one of the transcendental architectural and artistic milestones of Venezuelan Latin American modernity, transforming the country's history. One of the works that Villanueva commissioned was a site-specific work by Alexander Calder called Nubes Acústicas, Acoustic Clouds, for the auditorium Aula Magna. It was a ceiling installation created in 1952. The installation also carries a political dimension as it was created during a period of significant change at the university. And 2 years after the installation of the work, the auditorium hosted the 10th Inter-American Conference, a significant Cold War summit, adding to the installation political and historical relevance. Valteo Jaspek examines modernity's inception and implications, and Alexander Calder's work is at the center of it. In 2009, with collaboration with Iranian art historian Mehdi Farsin to create an exhibition titled Cultural Diplomacy, Art That We Neglect, the exhibition created parallels between Cold War politics and the artworks of Alexander Calder. The title was taken from a headline from a 1954 article of the New York Times in which the complete title was How U.S. Artists Might Win Friends and Influence Allies is shown in a South American exhibit. Part of Valteo Jaspek's Modern Entanglements U.S. Intervention Theories from 2006-2009 are altered photographs of the Aula Magna that draw directly from Calder's acoustic clouds. The seed print titled Architect Carlos Raúl Villanueva in collaboration with Calder, Ciudad Universitaria 1954. This production was from 2006-2009, was produced from a faded 1954 Kodachrome attributed to photograph Paolo Gasparini. Through this series, Valteo Jaspek delves into the government political strategies and the impacts of the university infrastructure, which also provides an analysis of the contemporary political concepts in Venezuela. The transformative use of the red filter in this photograph seems to reference as well the well-known use of color for left-wing ideologies reflecting the political climate at the time, the 50s with the Cold War. But another more contemporary look could be the use of the color and unrest during the Bolivarian Revolution of Presidents Hugo Chavez from 1999 to 2013, or current times, which was marked by social and political unrest. In 1939, just before the inauguration of the new Museum of Modern Art building in New York, museum staff who had a position of director of publications collaborated with a companion to devise arguably a protest aimed at the supervisors. Valteo Jaspek and Media Facin created a reproduction of this invitation titled RSVP from 1939. Enclosed with the invitation package was a small card bearing the inscription, "Oil that glitters is not gold," accompanied by a letterpress engraved of a crown. The original invitation was addressed to 7,000 prominent individuals, inviting them to the unveiling of Museum of Standard Oil. This reference is the intricate involvement of then president of the MoMA, Nelson Rockefeller, in the realm of oil, which was in closely ties to the family's history establishing the modern oil industry through John D. Rockefeller. This is also with the involvement like Media Farcín and Alessandro Valteo Jaspek. Another work that is Hotel Ávila and the mobile from the larger pictures, and involves Rockefeller's role as owner of Hotel Ávila, and this and the involvement of he commissioned Alexander Calder's sculpture for the ballroom of the hotel. Valteo Jaspek and Media Facin highlights the close intertwined histories of the United States and Venezuela, producing functioning as a function of research initiative and historiographical exploration, extensively delving into archives and while adopting a form of an exhibition concept. Central to the venture of modernist integrate relationship with political matters, as highlighted from the series from Modern Entanglements, U.S. interventions such as Rockefeller's connection to being MoMA's president. As Alfred Barr and his tenure at MoMA under Rockefeller acknowledged that perhaps we have not taken any great interest in South America had not been for the Cold War, which also our historian Pérez Barreiro wrote that MoMA approaches its Latin American venture as a little more than a shopping trip, as these trips and exhibitions serve as a parallel missions due to politics of the time as diplomatic missions. A little smart barrel of oil that alongside sits at the display that shows in real time the current market of a price label last oil barrel date postponed refers as a ready-made performance piece, shows the price of oil fluctuating according to the daily prices of oil of the New York Mercantile Exchange while it's being exhibited. By indefinitely postponing its date, the artwork contemplates the implications of this perpetual delay, noting that the constant change in value inquires in the actual value of it. Does it hold value because of the demand of the power struggles these resources has been immersed into? Art and commodity, fossil fuels, and exchange value, everything becomes fungible from the handout of the exhibition. This concept of fungibility, suggests a fluidity in which objects and concepts can be changed or substituted with one another, becoming a reflection on the nature of value and the implications on the contemporary society. One of the last works with direct interpretation of the name Vanitas 2008 standard, also referring to oil, conveys critical themes focused on the privilege, meaning with the meaningless of what was once the mundane. A photograph of a glass of whiskey with ice. The glass is draped with a white napkin, yet when we look closer, we can discover a thin layer of black liquid sitting at the top of the alcohol, which is oil. The layer of oil as an analogy of Venezuela's modernity, the thin layer representing the small group that once enjoyed the riches of this black hole, which historically pushed the country into prosperity. However, now what remains are the memories and consequences of the indulgence and oil that no longer holds its value. When in a similar approach, Chinchorro and Delta Guarao, a 2004-2010, both part of the series on Enredos Modernos, Chinchorros Soberanos, an installation uses hand-woven hammocks made in collaboration with unknown Guarao artists from the Amazon, made out of fibers of moriche palm tree, traditionally made by indigenous communities of the Orinoco Delta region, holding a neat house photograph, American photographer, Untitled Oil and Water, screen print to evoke a similar themes in transience and loss prosperity. This juxtaposition of the natural materials and the industrial imagery, oil and water, the tensions between the two resources that fundamentally resist each other, a metaphor for the complexities of human interaction, in which the environment and the consequences of the industrialization and extraction of these resources as the environmental impact of the ways of life in different indigenous tribes of the Amazon. In conclusion, for the transformative Venezuelan modernization project relied heavily on the exploitation of oil resources, symbolizing the promises of prosperity and progress. However, the intertwining realities, national and international, associated with it, raises the question if these promises were actually fulfilled. At its core, this inquiry delves into the essence of modernity itself, its aspiration and promises of the ideal vision of heaven with the complexities of reality prompts a reevaluation of the success of them. The intertwining contemporary events, violence, of oil exploitation do raise the questions about the success of modernity in Venezuela. This newfound prosperity brought by oil, which initially were promising, have far-reaching social and economical, political consequences within the power dynamics of the country. The transformative power of oil will reshape the fabric of Venezuelan history, that while influencing the different aspects of its cultural identity and political landscape, had other influences or aspects, Valteo Jaspek prefers modern entanglements. The inquiry and research made by artists such as Valteo Jaspek is its use of appropriation and rehistorization of this history. The discourse surrounding Venezuelan modernity is not mere a narrative of failure, ultimately is a discourse surrounding Venezuelan modernism might serve as a mirror of the past through which we can confront our own understanding of progress and development of it and its resonances to the present. This history of oil is deeply ingrained into the Venezuelan history, as historian Lisa Blackmore argues in Out of the Ashes Building and Rebuilding Nation, that Venezuelan history is characterized by this cyclical pattern of destruction and reconstruction, from Caracas earthquake to the War of Independence led by Bolivar to the current times. Blackmore emphasizes that the recurrent theme of using these architectural projects into shaping the nation identity building, using the oil resources, ultimately not only just serve as a temporary distraction, but as she suggests, that these visionary buildings often mask a deeper structural problems within the economy and the civil society, as they offer an illusion of civic unity and progress without addressing fundamental issues. Valteo Jaspek, delving into the social political implications of oil exploitation, not only Venezuela, but also looking at the international networks. These works and exhibition invite a critical examination of power dynamics, cultural narrative, and historical legacies associated with this industry. The reflections of modernity and the impact of oil in Venezuela's social and cultural landscape offer valuable insights and contribute to a broader understanding of the nation's history and challenges and the possibilities of the future.
Thank you. Panelists, if you'll come down, this is a good time if people want to grab a coffee or something like that as well. I'm just going to, for my Zoom audience, this will be, the end of your time with us. But we invite you to virtually applaud and congratulate your colleagues and friends and family, and we will see you later. Bye.